So now I'm having to record something. Yeah, don't necessarily know what it is gonna be, but well, I think that I'm actually gonna finish up with the article of Jordan Peterson and whether he is Stoic or not, because I'm just seeing that, unfortunately, once again, I have miscalculated the length of the article, meaning that, well, it's actually quite ended. So it's just a few paragraphs left, and so I'm gonna go through it, and probably afterwards maybe I'm gonna talk about something else, but it depends. I don't know that, but I think I've discovered something that no one else has any idea about, and I'm not sure I can do it justice. Its scope is so broad that I can see only parts of it clearly at one time, and it is exceedingly difficult to set down comprehensibly in writing. Which is a quote by Jordan Peterson to his dad, as far as I remember. Well, I can agree on two things. Whatever he saw, he did not see it clearly, and he certainly did not convey it comprehensibly. I hope to have marshaled enough evidence to show that Jordan Peterson is no Stoic, and that his philosophy is in fact anti-Stoic. Why then is he so influential? Why are we spending so much energy and time talking about him? I really can't do any better than put the answer as commentator. Commentator and critique Nathan Robertson did recently in what is the best and most in-depth critique of Peterson I've seen so far. If you want to appear very profound and convince people to take you seriously, but have nothing of value to say, there is a tried and tested method. First, take some extremely obvious platitude or truism and make sure it actually does contain some insight, though it can be rather vague. Something like, if you're too conciliatory, you will sometimes get taken advantage of, or many moral values are similar across human societies. Then try to restate your platitude using as many words as possible, as unintelligibly as possible, while never repeating yourself exactly. Use highly technical, while never repeating, well, even though he did, didn't he? While never repeating yourself exactly. Use highly technical language drawn from many different academic disciplines. So that no one person will ever have adequate training to fully evaluate your work. Construct elaborate theories with many parts. Draw diagrams. Use italics liberally to indicate that you are using words in a highly specific and idiosyncratic sense. Never say anything too specific, and if you do, qualify it heavily so that you can always insist you mean the opposite. Then evangelize. Speak as confidently as possible, as if you're sharing God's own truth. Accept no criticisms. Insist that any skeptic has either misinterpreted you or has actually already admitted that you are correct. Talk as much as possible and listen as little as possible. Follow these steps and your success will be assured. You know what Socrates used to call this sort of person? A sophist, and he didn't mean it as a compliment. P.S. Since I've been exposed to Peterson's supporters a number of times over social media, I can anticipate some of the obvious objections. The first one, if you think that I mischaracterized him or quoted him out of context, it is entirely useless to simply say so and walk away. Please provide a detailed explanation of why you think so, as well as a better, more fair interpretation of the same passages I quoted or the same notions I described. The second point is, if you think Peterson is being criticized out of envy, then you have no idea of critical discourse works. It's still a criticism. It's still a criticism, and it needs to be answered regardless of the real or imaginary motivations you attribute to the critic. The third is, if your response is along the lines of yes, but he has made a difference for many young people, that may be true, but there are positive differences and negative ones, and there are good and bad reasons why young people are influenced. The goal here is to steer them toward the good ones and away from the bad ones. PPS, please stop using lobsters as idealized examples of how human beings should behave just because they are hierarchical animals. It's really, really bad biology, and bad science is another unstoic thing. Lobsters are invertebrates, incredibly evolutionarily remote from us, and they don't have shoulders. And they don't have shoulders, by the way. Plus, those t-shirts really look silly. Continue reading. What if I press continue reading? Is there more to it? No, there's not more to it. Well, there's actually a comment from June the 1st, 2018. It's quoting the article. First off, the literature does not support the existence of significant cognitive differences between men and women. Did he even say that? Because I would have said something against it then. Maybe I've skipped the line. Could actually definitely be the case. Well, anyway, sure it does, and there's a Psychology Today article. Or to take scientific literature on Big Five, which Peterson harps on about. And then there's actually a study apparently. Stoicism holds that women and men are intellectually equal. There is plenty of textual evidence for it. Well, then Stoicism is wrong. Women behave differently and make different decisions than men. And there are clear patterns that emerge across cultures, ethnic groups, and time periods. And why not? The available reproductive strategies are quite different for men and women, and although evolutionary psychology is hardly empirical science, it would be unsurprising if this reflected in different behavior. In fact, I think the physical differences are more surprising. Shouldn't women rather be the larger ones, defending children and all? Another point, there are clear sex differences in hormone levels, which in turn affect behavior. No. Or what about animals? Are differences in behavior between bulls and cows, say, also just a result of their oppressive, patriarchal culture? ? But for every link you post here, I can easily counter Google another one that says otherwise. Which is, by the way, also quote, well, if I'm wrong about this, I would really like to see the evidence. Which, by the way, was liked by one person. There is actually a reply by Massimo, the author. Cattell, which is the name or at least username of the person, Cattell Malde. No, there is no good evidence of systematic cognitive differences between men and women that are not the result of learning. And there's a book, Delusions, How Our Mind, Society, and Neurosexism Create Difference of Gender by Cordelia Fine, as well as Brainstorm by Rebecca M. Jordan Young. As funny as it is, the fact that men and women score differently on the Big Five is entirely irrelevant. We are talking innate differences which are completely confounded with cultural and educational factors in these tests. Although evolutionary psychology is hardly empirical science, you mention it anyway to back up your points. Well, if I am wrong about this, I would really like to see the evidence. See above, now I bet you really, which by the way was a quote then from the comment. So see above, now I bet you will carefully read the two books. I linked to above and then come back here and admit that, in fact, there is no good evidence of innate differences between men and women in cognitive traits, right? And probably the person didn't do so, because there is no other points, there's no other comments, but there's actually somebody else that said quite a lot of things, and it is let me read. Massimo, I respectfully disagree with your conclusions that Peterson is sufficiently incompatible with Stoicism. Stoic philosophy to be worthy of being called an anti-Stoic, but I respect your commitment to speaking clearly what you think on a controversial subject for the benefit of others. Plutarch, as Hume allegedly said, truth springs from argument amongst friends. I couldn't agree more. I don't know how typical I am of people who see more than trivial compatibility between Stoicism and Peterson, but I suspect part of the reason I do is that I don't perceive Peterson's fundamental ethical guidelines to actually require the debatedly scientific research he grounds them in. I'm perfectly willing to admit that he doesn't write clearly in Maps of Meaning, and that I'm unmoved by his claims about sex differences, and frankly frustrated by his more than occasional tendency to see Christianity as a secret source which somehow can be held primarily responsible for the rise of the West. Still, to try and advance the conversation by noting 3 things I believe are misunderstandings of Peterson. Should I actually read it? Well, I'm gonna. For one, I don't think his clean up your room dictum is aimed at quidism. It's a dictum based in epistemological concerns, best what's immediately around you, designed to create your personal character. Now, fair enough, he doesn't list the Stoic virtues as the ones most important to cultivating a solid character, so perhaps he's better seen as a virtue ethicist rather than a Stoic on this one point of comparison alone. That said, if you try to fit him within a virtue ethics framework from Greek philosophy, it's clear he's hardly a Platonist, Aristotelian, Epicurean, skeptic, or cynic. At least when you compare him to ancient Greco-Roman schools of Phil, it feels responsible to compare him to Stoics, at least relative to the other schools. Second part of what I perceive to be misunderstanding of Peterson. I do not think his fundamental claim that we live within a set of hierarchies leads to competition. Consider the Stoics' 2 fundamental metaphors of 1, seeing ourselves as part of a cosmos, and 2, that we should see ourselves as limbs on the social body. Both these metaphors implicitly and explicitly summon the image of a visual hierarchy. Epictetus, when the foot sees its part in the body, it walks through mud willingly. There is clearly a fundamental assumption that our minds, as well as our societies, should be arranged hierarchically in accordance with social roles and their matching duties in Stoicism. But, and so this is the key point, a commitment to hierarchy does not necessitate exploration or competition, even though this is a risk which with such a social arrangement. Just because a Stoic or Peterson uses hierarchical images to structure our minds, our society does not entail they want us to compete mercilessly rather than work together as social animals. Finally, 3, the common sense objection. Anyone who critiques a thinker like Peterson or the Stoics for espousing common sense is most of the time making what I would argue is an arrogant mistake. What one person takes as common sense is rarely, if ever, actually common sense to others. And if your critique of a philosopher is that if your critique of a philosopher is that they speak about common sense, that hardly shows they are worthless, just that maybe you already understand that point, not that everyone else does, and therefore they shouldn't have published their works. Anyway, thanks for the post and kind comment, Massimo. Plutarch, I won't answer your points because I think my OP is clear about them. I honestly think you are far too charitable to Peterson and a bit obvious to the nasty tendencies inherent in his quote-unquote philosophy, but it is fair to disagree on this. And he actually says, I would fully agree. I'm not intending a rebuttal of your article by any stretch of the imagination, just trying to work out some of my thoughts in a way I hope is conducive to you and others about the Stoic/Peterson comparison. That said, I will completely agree with you that I may be too charitable to Peterson. I won't pretend there are not plenty who have abused the ideas of Peterson in practice. If you start with certain assumptions, for example, that hierarchies are natural, you always run the risk of certain abuses of practice, for example, exploitation, justified as quote-unquote natural by questionable evolutionary science. That said, there were among Socrates' disciples Crates and Alcibiades who cared less for the practices of virtue and self-cultivation and more for the power his debate style gave them in political disputes. I do feel there are Peterson supporters like Crates and the other one, but I'm also not convinced they are actually practicing what he preaches, but on this we may obviously and very fairly disagree. Well, yeah, anyway, I'm gonna end the episode there. A fairly interesting article, and I do want to point out, I do not necessarily have anything against Peterson. I don't necessarily think that he's not Stoic, just reading the article, and I probably have given some thoughts while reading. Maybe I have. I can't actually remember. Gonna see you the next time. Bye-bye.